Hello, Zach. This is your grandfather speaking. Your grandmother asked me to make some videos so you can know who I was, because as you get older, to really understand this, I probably won't be around. So I'll give you a little short background. First of all, my legal name is Bruce, but I usually use the nickname Eric. So when I go home and visit my family in Michigan, I'm Bruce, and in Korea, I am Eric. So the biggest thing in my life was military service. And so when I graduated from high school at age 17, I had had a previous conversation with my father, and he said that because his mother and him had put me through 10 years of private religious school, he wasn't going to finance my education. So I had to figure it out. He said, "You're smart enough to figure it out." So I decided to enter the military because at that time you had the draft system. Draft system basically meant that you had to go spend 2 years minimum in the U.S. military. Now that system was later discontinued. So I thought about it, and then I thought, no, I did not want to accept any loan from my father at 6% interest to spend 4 years in the university. 6% interest was normal interest at that time. So I decided in my senior year of high school to go in the military. So I was looking around, and I decided I wanted to learn a skill, something I could use after the military. So I looked at the difference between the 4 branches, and I decided it was Navy or Air Force, and I decided Air Force would give me the best thing because I didn't want to be on a ship. So I went in the Air Force for 4 years. And I spent 3.5 years as a management analyst in the financial and accounting section of the Air Force. And we basically looked at a lot of different things. And we looked on the basis of cost benefit. How much does it cost and what is the benefit? In other words, is it worthwhile? And then when I finished at 21, I went to the university. Technically, I went to a small school called the community school to finish my 2nd year. And as a junior, I transferred into Michigan State University and spent several years there. Now, one of the biggest differences in my life was at age 24, I was waiting to make a left-hand turn at night, about 9 p.m., and a drunk driver smashed into the back of my Volkswagen. At that time, there were no seatbelts. So I ended up with a brain concussion, and I woke up 12 hours later in the hospital. My father and mother came, and my father went and he phoned the accident report. Later I saw the car. Now, the reason I mention that is very similar to what you call the gap year in Europe. The gap year, GAP, gap year means after high school, you take 1 or 2 years off to travel around and do some things. You don't go directly on to the university. And so I had a gap year for a while. And so I was knocked out of the university, and so I spent a lot of time just wandering around campus and listening and talking to people. I'm not a person who joins groups. So I went and I listened. The second thing I did a lot of traveling in the States, and I did a lot of summer jobs and working jobs. I did a lot of manual labor jobs. I worked in Denver, Colorado, and in San Diego, California, and New Hampshire. That was at a camp. And I wanted to see what it was like, just a regular manual labor job. And my whole point was, I wanted to spend a lot of time to educate myself and learn a lot, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time doing what other people wanted me to learn. I wanted to do what I wanted to learn. So I just had the job just to give me money to support myself while I was studying and doing a lot of things I was interested in. And this is the point of that. In life, there's basically 2 ways you can handle life. Number 1 is you do what other people tell you to do, and you do it successfully. Or number 2, you do what you want to do. That means you make choices. And the basic difference between Korea, where I'm making this video, is in Korea, the parents generally tell their children what to do in the university, and they often select a major. Well, in the U.S., you have a little bit different idea. The kids can decide what they want to do. And so I had a great time. And the great time at the university was having a lot of free time to do what I wanted to do. And there were 2 things that I discovered very much in the university. Number one, I discovered science fiction. And science fiction basically is alternative ideas of life. And you have many, many writers nowadays. And you had some very famous men years ago that did a lot of science fiction writing. And the second one is I discovered Fyodor Dostoevsky. And he was in the late 1800s. He was a Russian writer, very, very famous. And he wrote psychological novels. And eventually I went back to university and I graduated from several universities. And then I did a lot of other stuff. So my life has been very simple. Number one, study. Number two, travel. And number three, work. And number four is adventure. So I did what I wanted to do. And this is what I'm talking to you about. It is your life, and you're the one that decides. So when you're going to graduate from high school, you might think about taking a gap year or 2 years off. And one of the problems with kids that graduate from high school, they don't know what they want to do. The parents want them to go to university right away. And that's actually a waste of money. So when you graduate from high school, if you haven't decided what you really want to do, take 1 or 2 years off and try different things. So when you finally go to the university, you'll be very, very focused. You'll be very focused on what you want to do. And it will be what you want, not what other people want for you. And so I graduated and then later got jobs working as a teacher because I was interested in ideas. But even when I was teaching during the vacations, I did a lot of traveling. I've been in over 50 countries. And I've been around the world right now about 5 times, around the world, going into and out of the United States from the East Coast and West Coast. And I traveled when I was in the university inside the States a lot. And your father, I brought him to about 28 states before he graduated from high school. So when he entered the university, he had been in 28 American states. And travel is important because travel gives you alternative ways of living and possibly thinking, because societies are different. Now, in the United States, there's about, depending on who you talk to, there's anywhere from 6 to about 11 or 12 different parts of the United States, regions of the United States, and they're quite different. And I worked manual labor jobs all the way from New York City over to San Diego, California, and from Michigan down to Texas. And manual labor is important because it gives you an idea how normal people live and how they think and how to get along with them. And you have to change, you have to adapt yourself. There's a famous saying, it's 3 words: adapt or die. And now in the 21st century, you get a lot of changes in the economy. And if you look at what happens from now until, say, 2050, there'll be a lot of changes. Your grandmother is interested in future studies. She's actually a professor of future studies. And she talks a lot about the future. I looked a lot at the past, and I've been very interested in history because we are basically thinking about what we've been taught to think. And history basically is a record of what happened, number 1, and number 2, why did it happen, and 3 is important. How can we prevent making the same mistakes? There's a Harvard professor called George Santayana, Harvard professor and philosopher, and he had a very famous saying, roughly around 1900, people who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. So the whole point I'm talking about is thinking, to develop your own personal way of thinking. You have a lot of people telling you do this and do that and think this and think that. Well, you would do it up to a point you have to do it. But then after that, you develop your own ideas. And it takes some time. Now, in the world now, there's a man called Jorden Peterson. He's a Canadian professor of psychology. He's comparatively young, compared to my age. He's 56 years old. And he's been quite popular and for the last about 2 or 3 years with different ideas because he thinks very differently. And this is my point to you. Do not be afraid of thinking differently because you have to develop your own ideas about what things are going. But there's a but here. But you have to be careful when you speak to them. I went to a religious school, so I didn't say a lot of stuff I thought because it was considered unpopular. And so you think, and then you decide whether you speak or you hold your tongue, but you do think. So the essence of what I'm saying right now is, your life is a preparation for your life and your future. And that is your life, and you're the one that has to decide it. And if you make mistakes, and people always make mistakes, but then you develop and you go on. And part of that is to get a dream of what you want to do. And you hold to that dream. Because that is what you want to do. Not what others want to do for you. What you want to do. And that is basically the essence of life. It is your life. You decide how you want to live it. That's all.